Aaron gathered his 4 sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ishamar, and his sister Miriam, and told them that God had commanded him to go meet Moses in the wilderness. Our uncle is dead, Nadab said. It was the son speaking to you. It's been 40 years, Father, without a word. Aaron held up his hand. Moses is alive. How do you know it was God who spoke to you, Father? Abihu leaned forward. You were out in the sun all day. It wouldn't be the first time the heat got to you. Are you sure, Aaron? Miriam cupped her cheeks. We've been hoping for so long. Yes, I'm certain. No one can imagine a voice like that. I cannot explain, nor do I have the time to try. You must all believe me. They all spoke at once. There are Philistines beyond the borders of Egypt. You can't survive in the wilderness, Father. What will you tell the other elders when they ask after you? They'll want to know why we didn't stop our father from such folly. You won't make it to the trade route before you're stopped. And if you do, how will you survive? Who will go with you? Father, you're 83 years old. Eleazar put his hand on Aaron's arm. I'll go with you, Father. Miriam stomped her foot. Enough! Let your father speak. No one will go with me. I will go alone, and God will provide. How will you find Moses? The wilderness is a vast place. How will you find water and food? You can't carry enough food for the journey. Miriam rose. Would you try to talk your father out of what God has instructed? Sit, Miriam. His sister merely added to the confusion, and Aaron could speak for himself. God called me to this journey, and surely God will show me the way. Hadn't he prayed for years? Maybe Moses would know something. Maybe God was finally going to help his people. I must trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to lead me. He spoke with more confidence than he felt, for their questions troubled him. Why should they doubt his word? He must do as God said and go quickly before courage failed him. Carrying a skin of water, 7 small loaves of unleavened barley bread, and his staff, Aaron left before the sun came up. He walked all day. He saw Egyptians, but they paid him no attention, nor did he allow his steps to falter at the sight of them. God had given him purpose and hope. Weariness and desolation no longer oppressed him. He felt renewed as he walked. God exists. God spoke. God had told him where to go and whom he was to meet. Moses. What would his brother be like? He'd spent all 40 years in the wilderness, had he? Did he have a family? Did Moses know Aaron was coming? Had God spoken to him as well? If not, what was he to say to Moses when he found him? Surely God wouldn't send him so far without purpose at the end. But what purpose? His questions made him think of other things. He slowed his steps, troubled. It had been easy to walk away. No one stopped him. He had taken up his staff, shouldered the skin of water and the pouch of bread, and headed out into the desert. Maybe he should have brought Miriam and his sons with him. No. He must do exactly as God said. Aaron walked all day, day after day, and slept in the open at night, eyes on the stars overhead, alone in silence. Never had he been so alone or felt so lonely. Thirsty, he sucked on a small flat stone to keep his mouth from going dry. How he wished he could raise his hand and have a boy run to him with a skin of water. His bread was almost gone. His stomach growled, but he was afraid to eat until later in the afternoon. He didn't know how far he had to go and whether his supply of bread would hold out. He didn't know what to eat out here in the desert. He didn't have the skills to hunt and kill animals. He was tired and hungry and beginning to wonder if he'd really heard God's voice or just imagined it. How many more days? How far? The sun beat down relentlessly until he looked for escape in a cleft of rocks, miserable and exhausted. He couldn't even remember the sound of God's voice. Was it all in his imagination? Birthed by years of misery and a dying hope that a savior would come and deliver them from slavery? Maybe his sons were right, and he'd been suffering from the heat. He was certainly suffering now. No, he had heard God's voice. He'd been on the point of exhaustion and heat stroke many times in his life, but he'd never heard a voice like that one. Go out into the wilderness to meet Moses. Go. He set off again, walking until nightfall and finding a place to rest. The inexorable heat gave way to the chill that gnawed at his bones and made him shiver. When he slept, he dreamed of his sons sitting with him at the table, laughing and enjoying one another, while Miriam served bread and meat, dried dates and wine. He awakened in despair. At least in Egypt, he had known what to expect. Every day had been the same, with overseers to regulate his life. He'd been thirsty and hungry many times, but not as he was now, with no respite, no encouraging companion. God, did you bring me out into the wilderness to kill me? There's no water, just this endless sea of rocks. Aaron lost count of the days, but he took hope that in that every day there seemed to be just enough water and food to keep him going. He headed north and then east into Midian, sustained by infrequent oases, and leaning more and more heavily on his staff with each day. He didn't know how far he had come or how far he had to go. He only knew he would rather die in the wilderness than turn back now. What hope remained was fixed on finding his brother. He longed to see Moses as intently as he had longed for a long draught of water and a hunk of bread. When his water was down to a few drops and his bread was gone, he came to a wide plain before a jagged mountain. Was that a donkey? At a small shelter? Aaron rubbed the sweat from his eyes and squinted. A man sat in the doorway. He stood, staff in hand, and came out into the open, his head turned toward Aaron. Hope made Aaron forget his hunger and thirst. Moses! Oh, Lord, please let it be my brother Moses. The man came toward him at a run, his arms outstretched. Aaron! It was like hearing the voice of God. Laughing, Aaron came down the rocky slope, his strength renewed like an eagle's. He was almost running when he reached his brother. They fell into one another's arms. God sent me, Moses. Laughing and sobbing, he kissed his brother. God sent me to you. Aaron, my brother. Moses held tight, weeping. God said you would come. 40 years, Moses. 40 years. We all thought you were dead. You were glad to see me go. Forgive me. I'm glad to see you now. Aaron drank in the sight of his younger brother. Moses had changed. He was no longer dressed like an Egyptian, but wore the long, dark robes and head covering of a nomad. Swarthy face, lined with age, his dark beard streaked with white, he looked foreign and humbled by years of desert life. Aaron had never been so glad to see anyone. Oh, Moses, you are my brother. I'm so glad to see you alive and well. Aaron wept for the lost years. Moses' eyes grew moist and tender. The Lord God said you would be. Come. He took Aaron by the arm. You must rest and have something to eat and drink, and you must meet my sons. Moses' dark and foreign wife, Zipporah, served them. Moses, son of Gershom, sat with them while Eleazar laid pale and sweating on a pallet at the back of the tent. Your son is ill. Zipporah circumcised him 2 days ago. Aaron winced. Eleazar meant, my God is help. But in which God did Moses place his hope? Zipporah sat beside her son, dark eyes downcast, and dabbed his forehead with a damp cloth. Aaron asked why Moses had not done it himself when his son was 8 days old, as the Jews had done since the days of Abraham. Moses bowed his head. It's easier to remember the ways of your people when you dwell among them, Aaron. As I learned when I circumcised Gershom, Midianites considered the rite repugnant. And Jethro, Zipporah's father, is a priest of Midian. He looked at Aaron in deference to him. I did not circumcise Eleazar. When God spoke to me, Jethro gave me his blessing, and we left the tents of Midian. I knew my son must be circumcised. Zipporah argued against it, and I delayed, not wanting to press my ways on her. I didn't see it as rebellion until the Lord himself sought to take my life. I told Zipporah that unless my sons both bore the mark of the covenant on their flesh, I would die, and Eleazar would be cut off from God and his people. Only then did she herself take the flint to our son's flesh. Troubled, Moses looked at the feverish boy. My son would not even remember how the mark came to be on his flesh if I'd obeyed the Lord instead of bending to others. He suffers now because of my disobedience. He will heal soon, Moses. Yes, but I will remember the cost to others of my disobedience. Moses looked out the doorway to the mountain and then at Aaron. I have much to tell you when you are not too tired to listen. My strength returned the moment I saw you. Moses took up his staff and rose, and Aaron followed. When they stood in the open, Moses stopped. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appeared to me in a burning bush on that mountain. Moses said, He has seen the affliction of Israel and has come to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, to bring them into a land flowing with milk and honey. He is sending me to Pharaoh so that I may bring his people out of Egypt to worship him at this mountain. Moses gripped his staff and rested his forehead against his hands as he spoke all the words the Lord had spoken to him on the mountain. Aaron felt the truth of them in his soul, drinking them in like water. The Lord is sending Moses to deliver us. I pleaded with the Lord to send someone else, Aaron. I said, who am I to go to Pharaoh? I said, my own people will not even believe me. I told him I've never been eloquent and that I'm slow of speech and tongue. He let out his breath slowly and faced Aaron. And the Lord, whose name is I am the one who always is, said, you will be my spokesman. Aaron felt a sudden rush of fear, but it subsided in the answer of a lifetime of prayer. The Lord had heard the cry of his people. Deliverance was at hand. The Lord had seen their misery and was about to put an end to it. Aaron was too filled with emotion to speak. Do you understand what I'm saying to you, Aaron? I'm afraid of Pharaoh. I'm afraid of my own people. So the Lord has sent you to stand with me and be my spokesman. The question hung unspoken between them. Was he willing to stand with Moses? I am your older brother. Who better to speak for you than I? Are you not afraid, brother? What does a slave's life matter in Egypt, Moses? What has my life ever mattered? Yes, I'm afraid. I've been afraid all my life. I've bent my back to taskmasters and felt the lash when I dared look up. I speak boldly enough in the privacy of my own home and among my brethren, but it comes to naught. Nothing changes. My words are but wind, and I thought my prayers were too. Now I know better. This time will be different. It won't be the words of a slave that are heard from my lips, but the words of the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If they don't believe us, the Lord has given me signs to show them. Moses had told him how the staff had become a snake in his hand and his hand had become leprous. And if that's not enough, when I pour water from the Nile, it'll become blood. Aaron didn't ask for a demonstration. They will believe, just as I believe. You believe me because you're my brother and because God sent you to me. You believe because God changed your heart toward me. You've not always looked at me as you do now, Aaron. Yes, that's because I thought you were free when I wasn't. I never felt at home in Pharaoh's house. I wanted to be among my own people. And we scorned and rejected you. Perhaps it was living among two separate peoples and being accepted by neither that made Moses so humble. But he must do as God commanded, or the Hebrews would go on as before, toiling in the mud pits and dying with their faces in the dust. God has chosen you to deliver us, Moses, and so you shall. Whatever God tells you, I will speak. If I have to shout, I will make the people hear. Moses looked up at the mountain of God. We will start for Egypt in the morning. We will gather the elders of Israel and tell them what the Lord has said. Then we will all go before Pharaoh and tell him to let God's people go into the wilderness to sacrifice to the Lord our God. He shut his eyes as though in pain. What is it, Moses? What's wrong? The Lord will harden Pharaoh's heart and strike Egypt with signs and wonders so that when they leave, we will not go empty-handed, but with many gifts of silver, gold, and clothing. Aaron laughed bitterly. And so God will plunder Egypt as Egypt plundered us. I never thought to see justice prevail in my lifetime. It'll be a joyous sight. Do not be eager to see their destruction, Aaron. They are people like us. Not like us. Pharaoh will not relent until his own firstborn son is dead. Then he will let us go. Aaron had been beneath the heel of Egypt's slave drivers too long and had felt the lash too many times to feel pity for any Egyptian. But he saw that Moses did. They set off at daylight, Zipporah taking charge of the donkey, carrying provisions and pulling a litter. Eleazar was improved, but not well enough to walk with his mother and his brother. Aaron and Moses walked ahead, each with a shepherd's staff in hand. Heading north, they took to the trade route between Egypt and southern Canaan, traveled by the way of Shur. It was more direct than traveling south and west and then north through the desert. Aaron wanted to hear everything the Lord had said to Moses. Tell me everything again from the beginning. How he wished he had been with Moses and seen the burning bush himself. He knew that it was what it was to hear the sound of God's voice, but to stand in his presence was beyond imagining. When they reached Egypt, Aaron took Moses, Zipporah, Gershom, and Eleazar into his house. Moses was overcome with emotion when Miriam threw her arms around him and Aaron's sons surrounded him. Aaron almost pitied Moses, for he saw that Hebrew words still did not come easily to his brother, so he spoke for him. God has called Moses to deliver our people from slavery. The Lord himself will perform great signs and wonders so that Pharaoh will let us go. Our mother prayed you were the promised one of God. Miriam embraced Moses again. She was certain when Pharaoh's daughter saved you that God was protecting you for some great purpose. Zipporah sat with her sons, watching from the corner of the room, dark-eyed and troubled. Aaron's sons went back and forth through Goshen, the region of Egypt which had been given to the Hebrews centuries earlier and in which they now lived in captivity. The men carried the message to the elders of Israel that God had sent them a deliverer, and the elders were to gather to hear the message from God. Meanwhile, Aaron talked and prayed with his brother. He could see him struggling against fear of Pharaoh and the people and the call of God on him. Moses had little appetite, and he looked more tired when he rose in the morning than when he retired to bed the evening before. Aaron did his best to encourage him. Surely that was why God had sent him to find Moses. He loved his brother. He was strengthened at his presence and eager to serve. You give me the words God speaks to you, Moses, and I will speak them. You will not go alone before Pharaoh. We go together, as surely as the Lord himself will be with us. How is it you have no fear? No fear? Less, perhaps. Moses had not grown up suffering physical oppression. He hadn't lived longing for the promise of God's intervention, nor had he been surrounded by fellow slaves and family members who relied on each other for strength just to survive the day. Had Moses ever known love other than those first few years at his mother's breast? Had Pharaoh's daughter regretted adopting him? In what position had her rebellion against Pharaoh placed her, and what repercussions had it caused Moses? It occurred to Aaron that he had never thought of these things before, too caught up in his own feelings, petty resentments, and childish jealousies. Unlike Moses, he hadn't grown up as the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter among people who despised him. Had Moses learned to keep out of sight and say little in order to survive? Aaron hadn't been caught between two worlds and accepted in neither. He hadn't sought to align himself with his people only to find they hated him as well. Nor had he needed to run away from Egyptian and Hebrew alike and seek refuge among foreigners in order to stay alive. Nor had he spent years alone in the desert tending sheep. Why had he never thought of these things before? Was it only now that his mind and heart were open to consider what Moses' life must have been like? Aaron was filled with compassion for his brother. He ached to help him, to press forward to the task God had given him, for the Lord himself said Moses was to be Israel's deliverer, and Aaron knew God had sent him to stand beside his brother and do whatever Moses could not do. Lord, you heard our cry. Oh, Moses, I've spent my life in fear, bowing and scraping overseers and taskmasters and still getting the lash when I fail to work fast enough for them. And now, for the first time in my life, I have hope. Tears came in a flood. Hope casts out fear, brother. We have God's promise that the day of our salvation is at hand. The people will rejoice when they hear, and Pharaoh will cower before the Lord. Moses' eyes were filled with sorrow. He won't listen. How can he not listen when he sees the signs and wonders? I grew up with Ramses. He's arrogant and cruel. And now that he sits on the throne, he believes he is God. He won't listen, Aaron, and many will suffer because of him. Our people will suffer, and so will his. Pharaoh will see the truth, Moses. Pharaoh will come to know that the Lord is God, and that truth will set us free. Moses wept.